Hey everyone, Ekman here with another video, and as we end the 2024 year, I want to do kind of a fun video, something more subjective than we normally do, but as we enter the third year of the One Piece card game, I want to do kind of a ranking of every meta that we've had so far for this card game. So I've been doing obviously a lot of content since the beginning. I've been here for each one of these metas, and I want to just kind of reflect on my thoughts of the game so far, entering the third year of it, and just kind of my personal favorite formats and least favorite formats that we've seen so far as well. So this is also going to be like a little bit more subjective, as mentioned, than my normal videos, but I will have some data on it. We've been covering this game since the beginning on my website, so we have all this data here from that as well. So that's going to be kind of the backbone for some of my arguments as well, and it should just be a lot of fun. So if you guys think I'm wrong, let me know. Let me know what you guys think is your favorite format and your least favorite format, and we'll kind of just jump on into it. So last thing though, before we get started, two kind of different things. One, my biases, so what I personally like as a format, and you'll probably see this kind of reflected in my rankings and my tier list, but I do like a diversity on leaders in the sense that there's a lot of different leaders that are viable, but also the gameplay for each leader is kind of different as well. So we've had some formats where like there's a lot of like the same deck that it's the only one that's doing well. We've also had some other formats where you can play a lot of different leaders, and even within those leaders you can have different builds and play styles and deck construction, which I kind of like a little bit more. I think the idea of being able to make a deck your own, make your own personal choices for ratios and tech choices, I think that's something that's indicative of a good meta, and something that I personally like in the game as well, being able to tinker and make my own deck builds, which I think is really cool. So that's kind of the idea for it as well. And then we have pretty much every format that we've seen so far. There have been some like tiny mini formats that we're going to be skipping. I'll kind of mention some of them as well. There's also been two pretty major 1 week formats where they are like the end of one set, but the new set isn't legal yet, but a restriction list has taken place. So the two kind of major ones are the end of EBO 1, where we had Sakazuki banned, but we didn't have OPO 7 legal yet. And we also had like the end of OPO 7, where Law was banned, but we didn't have OPO 8 yet. So I'm not going to rank these at all just because we only had them for 1 week. They're hard to say just how good those formats are personally, so they're going to be kind of gone from those ones as well. We also have kind of some of these like half step formats, which we'll talk about when we get there too, but I think this is pretty much a good understanding of what the formats and kind of the big metas have been for this game in general. So we're going to start off at the bottom with my least favorite format in the game, and it was pretty close honestly, but we're going to go with the OPO 3 format from the last year. So this format I think was pretty rough in a lot of ways. The fact that we got a whole new set and not a lot of the new stuff was being played with it as well. It was kind of the most of the year was with this kind of triple leader format where it was Law, it was Zoro, and it was Whitebeard just kind of reigning supreme for all of it. But also like the fact that like OPO 2 was kind of like this meta and nothing really changed in OPO 3. If anything, it got like a little bit more entrenched with red cards. But the fact that we also had a restriction list, you guys can't even probably tell when the restriction list came out. We hit some red cards and it didn't matter. Like red was still topping just as much, if not even more than it was, which is kind of silly if you really want to think about it. But the fact that red was so dominant in this way, the fact that we didn't get a lot of new stuff from OPO 3 and it was just a continuation of OPO 2 in a lot of ways. And spoilers in a second, we did just kind of move to OPO 4 with pretty much the same stuff on the beginning of it too. So I think it's my least favorite format. It was fine for what it is. I still think like every format in this game I would play an event for, but OPO 3 was it was probably the worst of it as well. And then it gets kind of like, I guess, negative bonus points for some people, I'm sure, because this is the set that also introduced yellow as a color, but also it's the set that added Nami to the game, which those are, based on my comment section, the least favorite things that I've seen people just complain about those cards. Those are pretty high up on that list of things that people do not like in this card game, and it had two of them. It had Katakuri and it had the Nami. So we're gonna put that on the worst format. Obviously we'll see those different leaders be a little bit more prevalent later, but that's what I've got for the worst one. And then kind of the second worst one, I was kind of jumping between if it was OPO 3 or OPO 4. I'm going to say OPO 4 was just like a little bit better. I do think this was a format where there were still decks that were viable, and we did see a little bit of those be present in this format as well. Particularly, we just saw, like, you know, obviously still, like, we saw a lot of Newgate, a lot of Zoro, and a lot of Trafalgar Law. Mostly, like, it wasn't as, like, bad as it was, I think, in OPO 3, but it was definitely to a point where, like, man, we've been playing the same 3 decks for 6 months, and we've had 2 sets, and they're still just the best decks, pretty hands-on for how this game works for it. So I kind of, there are like some peaks, like we did have like green and purple Dofi be present and honestly pretty good in this format. We also had some spots where like Katakuri got like a little bit better because beige was added to this format, which I think was the bane of a lot of people's existence too. There also was like this 4.1 and 4.5 we'll talk about later, which I think is kind of made it a lot better in a lot of ways. But 4 was just like, man, we had all these, we had 6 new leaders. They're all super cool. They're all multicolor leaders, and only like Dofi was viable, Queen was viable every once in a while, but even then they weren't always riveting games. We had Rebecca from this one, which I know has been a fan favorite for a lot of people too, but it just never really took off as a separate format in my own way. It's still like the same thing we've been seeing from OPO2, which was again getting very tiring by the end of 4, before we got all their kind of restriction stuff. So we're gonna put that as like the second to worst format, and we're gonna have that there as well. And then for the next one to kind of end up this kind of bad format here, I don't know if any of these are hot takes, but these are mine. These are OPO6, and I'm also gonna put EBO1 like slightly above it. I think these are pretty similar formats when you really want to look at it that way. One of the biggest reasons though for OPO6 though that I just did not enjoy this format was just the fact that we had like Gecko Moria and Sakazuki just reigned supreme, right? They were getting over 50% of the top cut in most events, and the fact that they played pretty similar, even though they are slightly different in deck construction, obviously it's a blue-black leader and a black leader, both of these are just decks that really took advantage of Gecko Moria, and using that is kind of advantage, which we hadn't really seen before in this card game. The removal was insane. There was just a lot of decks that just could not survive because every time you played something, something got removed, right? It was just a little bit too tempo oriented for that. It was really hard for you to get anything to stick on the board for a long time. And kind of like the bonus points it gets for being a bit of a rough format is that at the beginning of the format, they announced that they were going to ban the Sakazuki leader, but then they, at the end of OPO6, not at the beginning, which was really, really tough to know. Like, clearly Sakazuki is the best deck in the format. You're going to see his face plastered across this website. And he's just, I really would have liked to see what this format would have looked like without him around in a lot of ways. So this also did have EBO1 to get a couple more cards out. It also did make Sakazuki better because we had a better 2K Navy card with T-Bone as well. We also got the Brook 3 cost, which is doing really well currently in the game as well. But I just think like what really kind of soured this for me personally is that we just didn't, like, Sakazuki could have left. He could have even left at like the release of EBO1, right? I think a lot of people are like, sure, like give us a little bit of the format of OPO6 with Sakazuki, but man, it is just overstayed its welcome. It's just so present still, and I know a lot of people were just ready for that to kind of rotate out. So I also know a lot of people like this format though, because a lot of people like Sakazuki, and I know a lot of people got paid this format because they were very good with Sakazuki too. So obviously this is kind of where my biases come into it, but honestly, I think the better solution in my mind is that on the release of EBO1, we got the restriction on Sakazuki. I think that would have been better in general too. We did have like a couple formats where it was just with Sakazuki as well, so without Sakazuki as well. So I think like this obviously is like Law and Morio reigning supreme, right? But we did have a good of extra amount of decks, so this is the 1.5 format that people are doing. We just didn't really have this format for a long time, so I can't guarantee it was better in any way, but I would have liked to have some time to explore it as well. So those are kind of where it's at. But even as like bad formats, I don't think these were like terrible formats for like compared to a lot of other card games I've played either. So I think that's just kind of where it's at. But it's just like you kind of see the trend where both of these formats are kind of all the ones here were just like the extensions of other formats that were pretty solved, and then we had to experiment with not a lot of things as we went further and further into the kind of the same format with not much changing in the meta at all. So those are kind of like my bottom 3.5 with EBO1, but we're going to put those down there. So going to into like the good formats now. We do have the OPO2. We're going to have that as good. This is obviously kind of the start of like the red dominance with the second set for the card game. But honestly, for like the second set for this card game, this wasn't too bad of a format. It did get a little bit solved at the end because we do see a lot of this like Zoro and Law and Newgate. But you know what? One deck was new. Both these were just like a format old kind of thing. Nothing too crazy. We still had like Eustace Kid popping up. We had Kinemon kind of at the beginning of the format, but then as people kind of understood the deck a little bit more, it fell off just a little bit. We did have like Doflamingo pop up sometimes. We did have like Luffy as like another red deck. Black was introduced into this card game with set 2, which compared to how good Black is as a color in this game right now, it didn't really do a lot. It was just a little bit too expensive for a lot of its removal. The temple wasn't right there where it was. Gecko Moria wasn't in the game, obviously, either. The 8-drop. So you could still top with it. We do see like some Smoker tops here and there. We see some Emporio tops here too. But I think this is a fine format to kind of follow up OPO1 as well. Not like the best format in this game at all, but once it got solved, it kind of was understood, which is when the fact that it was continued for so long afterwards with OPO2 and half of OPO4, just the same kind of format with minor changes, that kind of ended up like ending its way. But in my mind, like as like the second set for this game, this was a pretty okay format. Nothing too bad with it. It got solved. We knew what decks were good, but it was still some variety, which I thought was really cool, especially for like the second set of a major card game like that. Sometimes it's hard to make a lot of diversity with it too. So we got OPO2 there. And the next up, we've got OPO5 right above it. And this is a really interesting format. It was kind of like the format that was our finals format, right? Last year was our finals format. It was like our worlds format. So it's a format that got a lot of eyes onto. A lot of people did a lot of testing because of the stakes of some of the tournaments for this, right? We've got the European finals, we got the North American finals, we had the Oceania finals. We also did have, I think I have the actual, no, I guess I don't. Do I not have the, oh, I swear I guess I don't have the world's finals list from last year on here. But the fact that like this was a bit of a solved format, you'll see that one big thing I think that this gets in its favor is that OPO5 was such a big shift from where we're at. Like OPO4 is kind of mentioned, it was so heavy on like the Newgate, the Law, and the Zoro. The game changes, the game shifts from here, right? It was such a big change. We had 6 leaders and 3 of them were immediately viable in the Sakazuki, the Enel, and the Purple Luffy. 2 leaders that are still viable, 1 that got banned, right? So obviously a very impactful set in its own way. And it was a little bit solved. I won't defend like this was a very diverse format, but it was to a point where like the best 3 decks in the game were diverse in their play styles and their deck building and everything else, where you could choose one of these 3, be pretty successful with it, and just more of what you think is the deck that kind of reflects your own play style. So I think that's something that's really important for a meta, and I think that's something that's here. I think this one, again, obviously as we went on a little bit more, Sakazuki obviously was still the best deck in this format. This was pre-Gecko Moria too, right? So it's not even like this was like full power Sakazuki. It didn't have like 1-drop Tashigi either or anything like that. We just had like the Black Navy stuff, but that was more than enough for kind of how this deck and this format ended up being. But we still had like some stuff pop up here and there. At the end of OPO5, you also got like the Uta Star deck, which made like some splashes here and there. But I think this was a fine format. I know a lot of people were really into testing this format and playing it again, with it being the end format. I know like OPO5 is like a pack by itself, was really popular for collectors, so a lot of people had packs for it. I know that it was a set that sold really well because of like the mangas and like having the Gear 5 Luffy and stuff. But I think this is a pretty fine format for what like a nationals and a worlds format to be. I think it was fine. I think there's been better and we're going to get better ones in the future, but nothing terrible. I'm happy about this being this one, and I think it's just like probably like the middleist format around where we've had for this card game. Nothing too terrible. Diversity could be a little bit better, but it's a solid one, and I think it's a pretty solid one. So there it is there. All right, and then to go next into, we've got OPO8, which this might be like a little bit low, but I'll kind of explain why my thoughts for this one in general. Honestly, I really like OPO8 as a format, and my only kind of issues with it is that it was the same as OPO7 with a little bit of changes. One, we had some card changes as well, but then also the fact that we didn't get Trafalgar Law for ours specifically because it was restricted on the release of OPO8 here in North America. But we did have like a good amount of variety in what our decks and leaders ended up being. I think the biggest issue though is that like we had this entire set, like OPO8 as a set came out, and we made like 2 card changes, right? We added Carrots to our jewelry bounty list. We added Jacks to our Rob Lucci list and maybe like a Kaido, and that was more or less it. Like that, those are like the main changes. There's some other changes here and there, don't get me wrong, but just the fact that we just didn't, nothing really changed from OPO7, right? This was just OPO7 with a couple extra cards added onto it, and then obviously the law getting out of it. We still have a good amount of diversity though. You'll see just so many decks just are viable in a lot of ways, and I do think that it's a solid format in its own way. We also have 8.5, which is kind of at the top here, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Spoilers, it ranked up a little bit higher than the other ones, but I do think this is a pretty solid format in itself. It just, like, the difference between OPO 7.5, where Trafalgar Law got restricted, and OPO 8 is minuscule. Not a lot changed between the two, and I think that's something that's a little bit, points away from it a little bit, but I do think this is a really solid format, and I do like what it does, but it's interesting just by itself, it didn't really do anything. It was just kind of, with OPO 8.5 and with OPO 9, I think the formats got a little bit better, which, spoilers, we haven't talked about those formats yet either, but I think this was a fine format. A lot of people, though, kind of just took a break until we had OPO 8.5. Also, just kind of like logistically, there wasn't like a lot of events for this format by itself, and a lot of people who we had to get regional invites again between the Dallas Card Fest in September and the Card Fest in January. So most people just needed to get a win, so they got their invite again to try Worlds in January. So I think it was a fine format, but definitely nothing too special either. And then to kind of wrap up the good format section, we do have the Star Deck 10 kind of thing. This kind of has like its own little lore, which I don't know how many people actually know about this. So real quick, and this, because this happened like a year ago, we had OPO4, right? This format was, as mentioned previously, I did not like this format quite a lot. It felt like just like a minor difference from what we've been playing for the last 4 or 5 months or so. So OPO4 comes out, we have some more games, and then they announce a restriction list for this card game. But there's also Star Deck 10, which I thought was super impactful. I kind of mentioned Star Deck 13 with EBO 1. I think all that kind of like mixed together, because Star Deck 13 by itself was not impactful on release. It just got better as time kind of went on. But we had like these big tournaments with OPO 4.1, as I called it, where the restriction list were legal, but we didn't have the new cards from Star Deck 10. Star Deck 10 was not legal. So then we also had like this month-long format where which we started calling 4.5, which we had all the Star Deck 10 stuff legal. Then we also had the restrictions for the red cards. And honestly, it was a pretty good format, all things considered. You'll see like a lot of diversity with it. We had a good amount of events for it, which is kind of silly to see how many events we had in just such a short amount of time. But it was really solid. I feel like there's a lot of diversity. The only reason I've kind of ranked it a little bit lower than like the higher eps is because we had it for such a small amount of time that there's no guarantees that this would have been like an actually good format if it was solved 100%. But look at like all the diversity we were able to have. Like obviously, I think Green Purple Dofi and Katakuri were two of the better decks in this format, and we've seen like Eustace Kid kind of pop up a little bit, but nothing too crazy, right? Like we do see like this one event here that where like Green Purple Dofi went a little bit crazy, but look at how much like decks that are viable. So many different things could be played, and I think it's a real shame we weren't able to kind of experience this format a little bit more in depth, because it looked like it had a lot of good things going for it as well. So we have it at like the end of the good format. If we had it like a little bit longer, it could be here and great, or it could have just been super solved in a bad format. So I think just kind of the gatekeeper for the good to great kind of line is where it's at. But I really like that format. It was such a kooky time too, just to see it got banned, and then I don't think I even mentioned they banned these cards for this, and then afterwards, like a week later, they said, "Hey, just so you know, it's only until OPO 5. We'll return all these bans back to it." So I know there's a lot of backlash immediately. I think their only mistake was banning the one drop Nami when they were also reprinting it in Starter Deck 10. So Starter Deck 10 was not viable was not playable on release because you had to like replace the Namis for it. But that aside, I think it was a good experience. It was a fun experience. I don't know. I like it. So we're gonna put it there in the good formats there. So we don't have a lot of formats left. You guys can probably guess a couple of them, but we'll go from there. So to start off the grade formats, I'm going to actually put OPO1, the first format in the entire game. And honestly, I will still say this, the first set of the One Piece card game is the strongest set of a card game I've ever played. It was so diverse. We had so many different decks that were viable. Every color were viable in its own way. We had so many different decks. Like, look how diverse these pie charts are for only having like 12 leaders in the game, right? We had 8 leaders from set 1. We had 4 leaders from the first 4-star decks as well. And just so many of them were able to top, which is super crazy. So I think it's pretty clear that Eustace Kid was the best leader in the game, but not by a wide margin. There's a lot of decks that were very strong in their own way. I was a really big fan of Red Star deck Luffy, so being able to have him viable was super fun. But there's just so many different decks that I thought were viable, and I think it was just such a good start for not only the competitive game, but just the game itself. You could play your favorite character, it would be strong in its own way. Law was strong, but not like too strong. Like Zoro was around, but like not too strong. I think there was a big debate of like Star Deck Luffy or Zoro was better, and I'm always in the Star Deck Luffy camp for OPO1. Clearly Zoro's stood the test of time and been the better leader between the two of them as we go on. But in set 1, I thought it was pretty close too. So we don't have a lot of data on this format since there wasn't a lot going on in the States for it, but it was a really good format. I think it was really strong and started like what I think helped make One Piece a really competitive game was just how good the game was from the get-go, which I thought was really strong. So all right, next up we've got OPO9 and the great format spot here, and this is honestly a really good format. It's our current format here in the English meta, so it's got like a little bit of negative points just because it's still going on and it hasn't been fully realized. I know a lot of people are getting ready for Card Fest finals for North America, which is happening this upcoming weekend too, so we don't have a lot of events for it here, but there's just so much diversity, I feel like, in a lot of ways. It's clear to me that Doflamingo is the best deck in the format, but it's also not like, I think, egregiously the best. I think there's a lot of ways to be able to counter it and interact with it. I do think that sometimes the deck just goes off and nothing can stop it, so that is a little bit of an issue with it, but I've been really enjoying like deck building and testing new stuff and playing in this format in general. It might be a little bit, and honestly, this has been like a big change from kind of OPO8 to OPO9 outside of like Dofi still being good. But the fact that a lot of older leaders, I think, have been more viable in the last little bit, especially with a little bit of the boost from the star decks, which we'll talk about that meta in a little bit too. But I think this is a really strong format for this game right now. And we'll see how it continues in North America too. This could be just a case where Doflamingo's like half of our pie chart, and then like it's Shanks and I don't know, something else, and that's pretty much it. So if that happens, we'll definitely kind of bump down in a little bit. But I've been enjoying it. I think deck building is a key part of what this kind of meta is right now, and I feel like there's some like undiscovered decks or undiscovered like builds that might be floating around, which would be really interesting too. So we're gonna leave that here in the great format, but I've been enjoying it quite a bit. And then we've got, spoilers, 2 different decks formats left. We've got OPO 8.5 and OPO 7, and this was really close. I didn't know which one I wanted to kind of pick, and there's also kind of like some recency bias, right? 8.5 was the one of our most recent like completed format, and it honestly was really strong. But if I was to be objective about it and kind of think about like my thoughts on the metas and my thoughts on like just how viable things are, I think I'm going to put it where OPO 8.5 is the second best format and OPO 7 is the best format. So depending on the day, I could switch these, but I think like the kind of best thing, the thing I want to kind of show is that this second half of 2024 has been a really solid couple of months for this game in general. OPO8 was like a little bit stale, but the fact that the star decks breathed a lot of life, not only into the card game, but like deck building and just the meta in general. 7 was such a good set too. I think there's a lot of diversity. We can look at how this kind of set went. There's just so many different decks that were viable. The fact that Sakazuki was finally banned, I think, was nice. We had like Rob Lucci be around. We also had like Bonnie having like green like viable for the first time in a long time. Black and yellow Luffy was at kind of full power with the 5-drop yellow Luffy as well, which helped out a lot. And now was still super strong in its own way. We had Nami, we had Red Purple Law, which Red Purple Law eventually did get banned at the end of it, mostly because of how good it was going to be in OPO8, not necessarily how good it was in OPO7 in the format. But I think this was a really skillful format in a lot of ways. You had a lot of different matchups, and the matchups weren't super polarizing. In OPO8, I feel like there are some matchups where it's just like 70-30, you have a hard time winning it. But honestly, there's like a lot of like 55-45s or 60-40s matchups where yeah, it could be tough, but it's still something you could win a lot of the time. I think the most polarizing is probably Enel versus Nami, which does exist in this format too, but there's just a lot going on into it. And then also, you'll see that 7.5 was still really strong in its own way too with the red purple law. There were a couple of like card fest going on for, you know, obviously Texas as well as the Liverpool one too. So I do think it's something that this format, if it was fully realized, it could have been like a little bit better too. But with it only being that like it was crazy, right? The biggest event of the competitive season was a new format that the world hadn't seen, which I think is really cool. But I also think it's like super stressful and high intensity for that too. So and I know a lot of people were planning on taking red purple law and they couldn't do that anymore, which I really feel like was unfortunate for those players. But I do think it was a really good format, and I think it's something that was really, really cool to see. And then also we have 8.5. So 8.5, I honestly like this format too, and there's just like a lot going on with it. It's pretty close, right? I think the fact like the deck building was super interesting with it. You'll see a lot for where there's a lot of different decks that are just viable in its own way, which is really cool, as well as just the fact that you're able to see. One, I was able to play Marco and do well with it, so I get bonus points for that. Where am I? Where am I in this? Where's the Top Cut events one? I think it's right here. Yeah, there I am. Boop, there I am, right in that slice. But I think the only thing that keeps this away from me is that it's pretty clear what the best 3 decks are in this format. It's Black and Yellow Luffy, Rob Lucci, and Doflamingo. There's a lot of other decks that are viable too, but these are clearly, I think, the best 3 in my mind. Bonnie and Enel, I think, bring up the rear as the 4th and 5th best decks, and there's a lot of diversity within those decks as it is, but I do think like the best 3 decks were very kind of, they overstayed their welcome just a little bit in my mind, and like obviously Dofi is just taken off into OPO9 without really any changes in the deck building either. But I really like the 8.5 format too. I think this was a really strong format for this game, and being able to get the star decks, be able to make a couple card changes and then make a valuable deck, I think is something that's kind of helped this format too in its own way. So I think this is where I'm standing for it, where from worst to best, with OPO 3 being the worst format we've had for this card game, and then OPO 7 likely being the best. I don't know. I could change these on any day. I think these are pretty close to each other and they've been a lot of fun, but I do think that this is where I'm sitting on the recording of this video. But all in all, I've enjoyed this card game. I think all these formats have had their own merits. They've been fun in their own ways, and more than not, like, we have more good formats are better than bad formats, which I think is kind of the key thing that I've seen from this card game. There are obviously times where I think some people didn't like a certain format, and that's totally fine. You guys are, able to do that. But consistently wise, I think there's a lot of good things that have been happening with this game. I think they've made a lot of good decisions with it, and I've been really enjoying just every time there's a new format, every leader, I feel like there's a reason to try to look into it and build it. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't, but I've been really enjoying this card game in its entirety. So that's going to be it for me. Let me know what you guys are thinking on your own kind of rankings and tier lists. But again, I hope you guys have been enjoying the One Piece card game and looking forward to more of it in 2025 and kind of seeing what that brings for us too. So thank you again for watching. I really do appreciate it. I'll catch you all next time.